So we've talked about the fact that if you leave private markets alone in the presence of a negative externality, the market is going to produce more than the socially efficient level of output because they're not taking into account those external costs that are being imposed. And so what we're going to talk about now is what can the government do to move the market closer to the socially efficient level. So the issue is there are these external costs, and the market left to its own devices only looks at the private marginal cost curve, doesn't add in those external costs to society, and so they produce more than would be socially efficient. So one thing we could say is if they're producing more than socially efficient, we could just say stop, right? We could say just put regulation, I'll call this Q bar reg. We can impose regulation and just say, that's not showing up very well, Q equal Q bar reg, saying that you this is what you can produce. This is sometimes called command and control. If you want, I think they refer to that in your readings. Command and control basically just saying, this is how much pollution we want. We want you to not produce more of your good than this because your good's generating this negative externality. So this is all you're allowed to produce. So it could be on the output of the good, or we could just say this is just the amount of pollution you're allowed to emit. And that it's very clear, it's very simple. That's the beauty of regulation. The problem with regulation is if you say everyone's only allowed to emit this much pollution, or everyone who's producing this good, because it generates a negative externality, is only allowed to do this much of it, you might be cutting back production of some goods that are much more valuable in society than others, or you might be making everyone cut back to a certain level when some people are really efficient at cutting back and some people aren't so efficient at cutting back. So regulations have the advantage of being very clear, but are unlikely to necessarily get us to the amount of pollution that we want in the most efficient way. Another approach, instead of just saying this is what you're allowed to do, because we're looking at the external cost you're generating that you're ignoring, well, another approach is to get them to not ignore that external cost, to what we call internalize the externality. We want them to take that cost into account, and the best way to do that is by imposing a tax, right? This is their cost of producing, and the problem is they're not taking into account this external cost. So what we do is we set a tax equal to that external cost. External. If we set a tax equal to that external cost, it raises their cost of production. Now they have to pay the marginal cost private plus the tax. And if the tax is the same thing as that external marginal cost, now they're taking into account when they're making their production decision, the suppliers are saying, here's my cost of production, here's the tax, so here's my total marginal cost of producing. And so when you impose that tax on me, I end up taking those costs into account because now I'm paying them. And so I'll cut back my output because those units now aren't worth it for me to produce because I have to pay the cost of production and the tax. And so if it's costing me more to produce, by taxing the producer, you're making them take that cost into account. That's the whole point. You're making them internalize the externality. And that's a way you don't have to just say you're only allowed to produce this much. You say produce as much as you want, but we're going to charge you. And the nice thing about the tax is that you can actually get revenue from it, right? You're charging people money. So instead of just saying only produce this much, if you impose the tax, you could get the same outcome as far as output, but you could also collect revenue, which in theory you could use to compensate the people that are being hurt by this. It looks a lot smoother on the whiteboard than it is in practice, of course, like who's exactly emitting, how actually big are the marginal external costs, how can we set a tax exactly equal to the marginal external cost, and who's being harmed if we want to use that revenue to compensate them. But you can see the idea is attractive, and this is a common way to deal with negative externalities. Like think about cigarette smoke, right? We tax cigarettes in large part to get people to consume less of them because consumption of those cigarettes generates this negative externality. So if we tax the cigarettes, fewer cigarettes will be consumed, less of that externality will be generated. because we're making the smoker take into account the external costs they're imposing by charging them for it. So that's the nice thing about taxes. They use the market to get to that socially efficient level. Another sort of market-based solution, maybe even more market-based in a sense, is they come by various names, but they're usually used for the negative externality of pollution, and it's marketable pollution permits. In this case, we do set a quantity, but we just set a total quantity. We only want 100 units of this pollutant emitted. 100 units of this pollution emitted. And so we, let's say there's 5 firms, you each get to emit only 20 units. And so you get a permit for those 20 units. So each firm, let's say 5 firms, they each get 20 permits, each good for 1 unit of pollution. But let's say you before this, you were emitting 50 units of pollution. You're like, well, I've got to cut back 30. Everybody has to cut back 30. Let's say we were all producing 50 units of pollution. We all have to cut back 30 units of pollution. But if it's really expensive for me to cut back my pollution, and it's not very expensive for you to cut back your pollution, I could buy your permits from you, right? So if I have to cut back 30 and you have to cut back 30, and it's going to cost you $20 a unit to cut back, and it's going to cost me $1,000 a unit to cut back, like, dude, I'll buy your permit for $500. It'd be anything. If I could pay less for the permit than it would cost me to clean up, I'd want to buy it. If you can clean up for a cost less than I'd be willing to pay you for the permit, it's worth it for you to sell it. And so by doing this, we really take advantage of the market. This is, if we, in the externality regulating lingo, it's often referred to as cap and trade, as opposed to command and control says this is what you're allowed to do. Cap and trade says we're going to put a cap on, we're going to say here's the total limit, but then you can trade these permits amongst yourselves. And so it gets around the problem that we talked about with regulation, where some firms it might be really expensive to reduce pollution, some firms it might not. We don't even have to worry about that. We just put the permits out there for however much pollution we want, and then we let the firms sell them, buy and sell them. And that way we'll get the amount of pollution we want, but we'll get it in the most efficient way. The firms for whom it's really expensive to cut back pollution will buy the permits. The firms for whom it's cheaper to clean up, they'll clean up and sell their permits to the more expensive firms. So we get the same reduction in pollution, but we get it more efficiently. So in markets for pollutants like carbon dioxide and things like that, we do have emissions permits in California, and there's a lot of places worldwide that have worked with some of these. It doesn't work for every pollutant because you have to be able to know who's emitting and measure who's emitting, and it has to be something where if you are emitting the pollution 5 miles from here and I'm emitting it here, it still makes sense for me to be able to sell my rights. If it's very localized, like mercury pollution, it doesn't work so well for. But for some things, and you can see the attractiveness of that option, because we can get a set amount, but we can get it most efficiently, because whoever is cheapest at reducing pollution, they'll do it and they'll sell their permits. The other thing is, if you start the process by auctioning the permits, again, the government can get revenue from doing that, and so there's that advantage there, and then they can use that money to combat environmental damage or whatever else they might want to do. So these are sort of the main things we do. We also sometimes just, the term that's often used for it, so I'll use it, although it's fancier than it needs to be, I think, is moral suasion. Just, saying, like Woodsy Owl. Do you remember Woodsy Owl? Probably not. He was a long time ago. He said, give a hoot, don't pollute. We have advertisements to say, don't do things that are generating negative externalities. We have advertisements against smoking that show all the people that you could be killing with your secondhand smoke, or this is your brain on drugs. We have advertisements to say, don't text and drive. These things are generating negative externalities on people who aren't making the decision, right? You decide to text when you're driving down the freeway, and there's somebody that's driving next to you that had no part in this decision, or the fact that you have a phone, or any decision you chose to make based on your own cost and benefits. And if you run into them, yeah, you've generated a significant external cost. So we sometimes just, there's other things we do. We have regulations, we have laws about where you can smoke, we have laws about not texting and driving and things like that. But a lot of times we also rely on, so we don't do these, just one of them, but a lot of times we also rely on saying, just don't do that. Okay? And that can be effective to some extent. But for things like pollution and big firms are less likely to be swayed by moral suasion. And so taxing and these marketable pollution permits where they work, or sometimes regulation when we just want to say, this is all we want and that's it. There's a variety of approaches we can take to try. But in any case, the whole goal, remember, is to find a way to reduce the emission of the externality, to move the market closer to the socially efficient level of pollution, which is kind of strange to say, but that's going to be the subject of our next video.